Hello guy, welcome back to my new channel. When we cast our minds to the Olympic Games, our thoughts are often captured by the spectacle of the present. We see the flash of stadium lights, the sea of national flags, and the incredible feats of modern athletes pushing the very limits of human potential. It is a festival of speed, strength, and skill that unites the globe in a shared moment of awe. Yet, this dazzling event is not a modern invention, it is a powerful echo, a vibrant resonance of a tradition born nearly 3,000 years ago in a quiet, sacred sanctuary in southern Greece. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our journey does not begin with an athletic contest, but with a patch of sacred ground. We must travel back in time, not to a city, but to a sanctuary. Long before it was the site of the world's most famous games, Olympia was, above all else, a holy place, a precinct dedicated to the gods. It was nestled in a fertile valley in the western Peloponnese, a region known as Elis, where the gentle river Alpheus meets its tributary, the Cladeus. This was not a strategic location for trade, nor a natural stronghold for a fortress. Its importance was purely spiritual. For centuries before the first recorded foot race, this land was believed to be a place where the veil between the mortal and divine worlds was exceptionally thin. It was a place of ancient cults and primal earth deities, a landscape imbued with a deep, resonant sanctity that drew worshippers from across the scattered settlements of archaic Greece. The air here was believed to be different, charged with divine presence. The very trees, particularly the wild olive, the oak, and the plane tree, were seen not as mere flora, but as living conduits to the gods, their whispering leaves carrying messages from the heavens. This primordial sanctity is the bedrock upon which everything else was built. The games were not the purpose of Olympia, they were an outgrowth of its holiness, a spectacular offering born from a place that was already sacred. The earliest origins of worship at Olympia are lost to the mists of prehistory, predating not only the Greeks we know from the classical era, but even the Mycenaeans of the Bronze Age. Archaeological evidence points to activity dating back to the Neolithic period, suggesting that this particular spot has been a focus of human reverence for an almost unimaginable length of time. The first cults were likely chthonic, centered on earth goddess worship and fertility rites, tied to the rich, life-giving soil of the valley. Legends, which the later Greeks used to explain their own history, spoke of this era. One story tells of how the Titan Cronus ruled from this very place, long before his son Zeus overthrew him. The nearby hill of Cronus, or Cronion, a gentle, conical hill that overlooks the sanctuary, was named for him and remained a focal point of ancient veneration. In this pre-Olympian age, the central figure of worship may have been Gaia, the primordial mother goddess, or perhaps her daughter, Themis. The original oracle at Olympia, long before the famous oracle of Apollo at Delphi gained prominence, was said to have belonged to Gaia. This was a place where priests would interpret the rustling of leaves or the patterns of thrown stones to divine the future, a direct consultation with the earth itself. This deep-rooted connection to earth worship and ancient, powerful female divinities is crucial. It tells us that Olympia's sacred power was not an invention of the Zeus-worshipping Hellenes, but an inheritance they adopted, adapted, and ultimately transformed. The arrival of the Hellenic tribes in Greece sometime in the 2nd millennium BCE brought with it a new pantheon of sky gods. This led to a gradual but profound shift in the religious landscape of Olympia. The powerful male sky god, Zeus, began to supplant the older female earth deities. This was not always a violent conquest, but often a process of syncretism and absorption. The new gods were layered over the old, their myths intertwining with the existing local legends. The Hill of Cronus was recontextualized as the site of the final battle between the young Zeus and his father, a cosmic struggle for control of the universe. The victory of Zeus marked the establishment of a new world order, and Olympia became the primary center in all of Greece for his worship as Zeus Olympius, Zeus of Olympus, king of the gods and men. The focus of the sanctuary shifted from the earth to the sky. The central point of worship was no longer a cave or a fissure in the ground, but a simple, open-air altar. This was not a grand, architectural structure, but a sacred mound made from the accumulated ashes of countless sacrifices. Over the centuries, this altar of Zeus grew into a massive conical pile of ash, mixed with the consecrated remains of burnt offerings, standing as a porous, grey monument to millennia of devotion. It was here that the most important rituals took place, where the smoke from sacrificed animals rose directly to the heavens, carrying the prayers of mortals to their celestial king. This transition gave rise to a rich tapestry of founding myths, as the later Greeks sought to explain how this sacred place came to be and how the games themselves were inaugurated. These were not historical accounts, but etiologies, stories created to explain the origins of a ritual or institution. One of the most prominent legends centered on the hero Pelops, from whom the entire Peloponnese peninsula takes its name. According to the myth, the local king, Oenomus, had a beautiful daughter named Hippodamia. An oracle had foretold that Oenomus would be killed by his son-in-law, so he devised a deadly contest for any suitor. The challenger would have to take Hippodamia in a chariot and flee, while Oenomus, who possessed divine horses gifted by his father Ares, the god of war, would give chase. If he caught the suitor, he would kill him. 13 suitors had already met this grim fate, their heads adorning the king's palace. Pelops, a handsome youth from Anatolia, devised a plan. He prayed to the god Poseidon, who granted him a golden chariot drawn by winged, untiring horses. More importantly, in a darker version of the tale, Pelops bribed Oenomus's charioteer, Mythilus, promising him half the kingdom and the first night with Hippodamia if he would sabotage the king's chariot. Mythilus agreed, replacing the bronze linchpins of the royal chariot with pins made of wax. During the chase, the wax melted, the wheels flew off, and Oenomus was thrown from his chariot and killed. Pelops claimed his bride and the kingdom, but then treacherously murdered Mythilus by throwing him into the sea to avoid paying his debt. As Mythilus fell, he cursed Pelops and his entire lineage, a curse that would lead to the tragic saga of the House of Atreus, involving Agamemnon, Clytemnestra, Orestes, and Electra. To purify himself of the blood guilt from killing both Oenomus and Mythilus, Pelops was said to have established the Olympic Games as funerary honors for the dead king. Another powerful founding myth, recounted by the poet Pindar, attributes the game's origin to an even greater figure, the divine hero Heracles, the son of Zeus. In this version, Heracles, after successfully completing his 5th labor, the cleaning of the Augean stables in the nearby kingdom of Elis, was cheated of his promised payment by King Augeas. In retaliation, Heracles returned with an army, conquered Elis, and sacked the city. To celebrate his victory and to honor his father, Zeus, Heracles himself laid out the boundaries of the sacred precinct at Olympia. He measured out the grounds, dedicated the finest spoils of his victory to the sanctuary, and planted a sacred grove of olive trees, which he brought from the land of the Hyperboreans, a mythical people of the far north. He then inaugurated the very first games, competing in them himself, and honoring the victors with crowns made from the leaves of the wild olive trees he had planted. This myth is particularly significant, because it directly connects the games to Zeus and to the greatest of all Greek heroes. It also establishes the olive crown, the kotinos, as the symbolic prize, a reward with no material value but immense honor. These two myths, that of Pelops and that of Heracles, coexist, and they highlight the complex web of meanings associated with the early games. They were simultaneously funerary rites to appease the dead, purification rituals for blood guilt, and celebratory festivals of military victory and divine honor. Before the formal athletic contests began, Olympia served as a critical nexus for the fragmented and often warring city-states of ancient Greece. It was a place of pan-Hellenic identity, one of the few locations where a Greek from Sparta and a Greek from Athens, despite their political differences, could recognize a shared heritage, language, and religion. The sanctuary was managed by the local authorities of Elis, who held a position of immense prestige and responsibility. They were the guardians of the sacred space, the organizers of the festivals, and the arbiters of its law. Olympia was a neutral ground, a place where diplomats could meet, treaties could be forged, and alliances could be proclaimed. Engraved copies of important interstate treaties were often inscribed on bronze plaques, and erected within the sanctuary for all to see, placing the agreements under the direct protection and witness of Zeus. This function as a political and diplomatic hub was just as important as its religious role. It reinforced the idea of a collective Greek identity, a Hellas, which stood in contrast to the world of the barbarians, the non-Greek speaking people. The shared reverence for Zeus, Olympias, and the heroes Pelops and Heracles created a sense of community that transcended the fierce local loyalties that otherwise defined the Greek world. The games would later amplify this pan-Hellenic spirit to an unprecedented degree, but the seeds of that unity were sown long before in the shared worship at Olympia's ancient altar. The physical layout of the early sanctuary, in the centuries before the 8th century BCE, was simple and naturalistic. The sacred precinct, known as the Altis, was an open, irregularly shaped area defined by the hill of Cronus to the north, the river Alpheus to the south, and the river Claudius to the west. This was not a space of grand architecture. Its power came from its natural features and its sacred monuments. The focal point was the great ash altar of Zeus, a primitive but profoundly sacred mound. Nearby stood the Pelopion, the tomb or cenotaph of the hero Pelop. This was a small, tumultuous-like mound, enclosed by a stone wall and dotted with trees, where rituals and sacrifices were made in his honor, acknowledging his foundational role as the hero of the region. The space was shaded by a sacred grove of wild olive, plane, and poplar trees, which were themselves objects of veneration. The earliest structures were likely simple, utilitarian buildings for housing priests or storing valuable offerings. The first temple on the site was not dedicated to Zeus, but to his wife and sister Hera. The construction of the original Heraion, or Temple of Hera, around 650 BCE represents a significant moment in the sanctuary's development, a first step towards the monumental architectural landscape that would later define it. Initially built with wooden columns, it was gradually renovated over the centuries, with each wooden column being replaced by a stone one as it decayed, creating a fascinating non-uniform colonnade that served as a living museum of architectural history. But for centuries, the heart of Olympia remained an open, green space, a sanctuary where nature and religion were inextricably intertwined. The specific impetus that transformed these long-standing religious festivals into a formal, regularly scheduled athletic event is a subject of intense scholarly debate. The traditional date for the first Olympic Games is 76 BCE, a date calculated by later Greek historians like Hippias of Elis. This date was based on lists of victors in the first, and for a time, only event, the Stadion race. While this date is almost certainly a later reconstruction, it marks the point at which the Greeks themselves began to formally historicize the Games. What might have triggered this formalization? One theory points to the changing social and political landscape of the 8th century BCE. This was a period of rising population, the emergence of the polis or city-state, and increased trade and colonization. In this dynamic but unstable world, there was a growing need for mechanisms that could foster a sense of shared Greek identity and manage interstate rivalries. The establishment of a formal, pan-Hellenic athletic festival at the most revered sanctuary of Zeus could have been a deliberate cultural invention designed to meet this need. It offered a structured outlet for the competitive, honor-driven ethos of the Greek aristocracy, a way to channel the warrior's desire for glory, or kleos, into a non-lethal and ritually contained context. Instead of winning fame by sacking a neighboring city, a nobleman could win fame by being the fastest man in Greece. Another compelling theory links the origins of the Games to the rise of hero cults and the importance of funerary games in Greek society. As seen in the myth of Pelops, athletic contests were a traditional way to honor a dead hero or king. The epic poems of Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which were being composed and recited around this same period, contain vivid descriptions of such funerary games. In the Iliad, after the death of his beloved companion Patroclus, the hero Achilles stages a magnificent series of athletic contests in his honor, including chariot racing, boxing, wrestling, and running. These games were not mere entertainment, they were a solemn ritual, a way of celebrating the life and virtues of the deceased, and of re-establishing social order after the disruption of death. It is plausible that the Olympic Games evolved from a similar local tradition of funerary games, perhaps in honor of the hero Pelops, whose tomb was a central feature of the Altis. Over time, these local games may have grown in importance, drawing participants from further afield, until they were formalized into the Pan-Hellenic festival we know today. This theory elegantly connects the games to one of the most deep-seated traditions in Greek culture, and explains the powerful connection between athletics, death, and hero worship. The very first event, and for the first 52 years the only event, was the Stadion race. This was a simple sprint, approximately 19.2 meters or 630 feet in length. The name of the race, Stadion, eventually came to refer to the place where it was held, the stadium itself. The length of the race was not arbitrary. It was said to have been the distance Heracles could run in a single breath. The original racetrack at Olympia was not a grand architectural structure. It was simply a prepared, flat stretch of earth within the sanctuary, with a starting line and a finishing line. The athletes, who were freeborn Greek men, competed naked, a practice that was unique to the Greeks and shocking to other cultures. This nudity, known as gymnos, is the root of our word gymnasium. It was a symbol of transparency and democracy, a way of showing that there were no hidden advantages and that all competitors stood equal before the gods, their status defined only by their physical prowess. There were no team sports. All competition was individual, a reflection of the Greek focus on personal excellence and honor, known as arete. The winner of the Stadion race was considered the champion of the entire Olympia. His victory was so significant that the entire 4-year period leading up to the next games would be named after him. He was not just a sports hero, he was a historical marker, a man whose name would be remembered for centuries. The concept of the Olympic truce, or ikechira, was another critical element that allowed the early games to flourish. This was not a general peace treaty across all of Greece, but a sacred and binding agreement that guaranteed safe passage for all athletes, officials, and pilgrims traveling to and from the games. It was proclaimed by heralds sent out from Elis weeks before the festival began. During the period of the truce, all participating states were forbidden from waging war, carrying out legal disputes, or imposing the death penalty. Any state that violated the truce would be heavily fined and banned from the game. This was a religious injunction protected by the authority of Zeus himself, and it was remarkably effective. The truce was a pragmatic necessity. Without it, travel through the fragmented and often hostile territories of ancient Greece would have been impossible. But it was also a powerful symbol. For a brief sacred period every 4 years, the entire Greek world agreed to set aside its quarrels and come together in peace. This created a bubble of Pan-Hellenic unity, a shared space where competition could take place, without bloodshed, under the watchful eyes of the gods. The truce elevated the games beyond a mere athletic event, and turned them into a cornerstone of Greek diplomacy and a recurring celebration of a shared cultural identity. The earliest organization of the games was relatively simple, managed by the authorities of Elis. The judges, who came to be known as the Hellenodikai, were chosen from the leading families of the region. Their role was immensely prestigious and carried enormous responsibility. They were not just referees, they were the guardians of the sacred laws of the games. They had swear a solemn oath to judge fairly, to accept no bribes, and to keep the secrets of their deliberation. Before the games began, they would spend a mandatory period of 30 days in a special building in Elis, where they would purify themselves and study the rules and traditions of the competition. They oversaw the 30-day training period that all athletes were required to undergo in Elis before being allowed to compete at Olympia. This was a vetting process, designed to weed out those who were not serious competitors and to ensure that everyone was aware of the rules. The Hellenodikai had the power to disqualify athletes for cheating or for any infraction of the rules, and they could impose heavy fines or even corporal punishment, such as public flogging. Their presence ensured that the games were conducted with a level of solemnity and fairness befitting a sacred festival for Zeus. They were the human embodiment of the divine order that the games were meant to celebrate. The rewards for victory at Olympia were, in a material sense, worthless. The prize was a simple crown, the kotinos, woven from the branches of a sacred wild olive tree that grew in the Altis. This tree, known as the Kallistophanos, was said to have been planted by Heracles himself. A young boy, both of whose parents had to be alive, would cut the branches for the crowns with a golden sickle. This prize was a deliberate statement about the values of the games. Victory was not about wealth or material gain. It was about honor, glory, and the pursuit of excellence. The Kotinos was a symbol of the victor's connection to the gods and the hero Heracles. However, while the official prize was symbolic, the unofficial rewards upon returning home were immense. An Olympic victor was treated as a national hero. His city would often tear down a section of its defensive walls to welcome him home, a symbolic gesture suggesting that a city with such a man no longer needed walls for its defense. He would be showered with honors, given free meals for the rest of his life, granted front-row seats at the theatre, and sometimes even have statues erected in his honor. Poets like Pindar and Bacchylides would be commissioned to write magnificent victory odes, which would be performed by a chorus and would ensure that the athlete's name and achievement lived on for generations. In this way, the victor achieved a form of mortal immortality, his kleos secured forever. Over the course of the next 2 centuries, the Olympic festival slowly expanded from its single brief event into a more complex multi-day affair. In 7024 BCE, the Dialos was added, a foot race covering 2 lengths of the stadium, requiring the athletes to make a difficult turn around a post. 4 years later, the Dochu, a long-distance race of about 24 stades, or nearly 3 miles, was introduced. These additions tested different aspects of athletic ability, moving beyond pure speed to include endurance and strategy. Then, in 708 BCE, the Games took a major leap forward with the introduction of 2 new complex events, wrestling, pale, and the pentathlon. Wrestling was a highly skilled and brutal grappling sport where the goal was to throw your opponent to the ground 3 times. The pentathlon was a 5-event contest designed to identify the best all-around athlete. It consisted of the stadium race, the long jump halma, the discus throw discus, the javelin throw akon, and wrestling. The long jump was particularly unique, performed with the aid of heavy stone or lead weights called halteres, which the athlete would swing forward to increase his momentum. The discus and javelin were not just tests of strength, but of grace and technique. The inclusion of these events marked a significant evolution, creating a more varied and comprehensive test of the athletic ideal. The expansion continued with the introduction of boxing pecs in 638 BCE. Ancient boxing was a brutal and dangerous affair. The fighters wrapped their hands in leather thongs, called himantes, which were designed not to soften the blow but to protect the puncher's knuckles and inflict more damage. There were no rounds and no weight classes. The fight continued until one man was knocked out or surrendered by raising a single finger. The contests were grueling tests of endurance and toughness, and serious injuries were common. 8 years later, in 680 BCE, the most prestigious, dangerous, and aristocratic event of all was introduced, the 4-horse chariot race, the Tethrypon. This event took place in a large, open racetrack called the Hippodrome. The races involved multiple laps around a course, with hair-raisingly tight turns around the posts at either end. Chariot racing was a sport for the immensely wealthy, as the cost of breeding, training, and maintaining a team of horses was exorbitant. The victory was awarded not to the driver, who was usually a hired professional, but to the owner of the chariot and horses. This allowed the wealthy elite, and even women, who were forbidden from competing in or even watching the athletic events, to participate as owners and claim the immense prestige of an Olympic victory. The spectacle of the chariot race, with its thundering hooves, clouds of dust, and frequent spectacular crashes, quickly became the premier event of the festival. By the 7th century BCE, the sanctuary at Olympia was beginning its slow transformation into a major architectural center. The offerings dedicated by victorious athletes and wealthy city-states were becoming increasingly lavish. Small temple-like buildings known as treasuries began to be constructed along a terrace at the foot of the hill of Cronus. These were built by individual city-states, such as Gala, Megara, and later Syracuse, to house their most valuable dedications and to serve as a permanent advertisement of their wealth and piety. These treasuries were a physical manifestation of the competitive spirit of the Greek polis, each one vying to be more magnificent than its neighbor. The construction of the great temple of Hera around the same time marked a new level of architectural ambition. The sanctuary was evolving from a rustic natural grove into a meticulously planned religious and athletic complex. This physical development mirrored the growing importance of the games themselves. As the festival became more central to Greek life, the sanctuary that housed it had to become more magnificent, a fitting home for the king of the gods, and a worthy stage for the greatest athletic spectacle in the Hellenic world. The early Olympics were exclusively for men, but women had their own separate festival at Olympia, known as the Heraian Games. These were held in honor of the goddess Hera, likely predating the men's games, and hearkening back to the sanctuary's ancient fertility cults. The Heraian Games took place every 4 years, but not in the same year as the Olympics. The competitors were unmarried young women, who, like the men, competed in a foot race. However, their race was slightly shorter than the men's stadion, and they did not compete nude. They wore a simple tunic called a chiton, which left their right shoulder and breast bare, a costume that may have had ancient ritual significance. The festival was organized by a group of 16 respected women from Ely, who wove a sacred robe, or peplos, as an offering for the cult statue of Hera. The victors of the Heraian races were, like the men, crowned with wreaths of sacred olive. While the Heraian Games never achieved the fame or Panhellenic importance of the Olympics, their existence is a vital reminder that athletic competition and religious devotion were not solely a male pursuit. They represent a separate but parallel tradition of female athleticism within the sacred space of Olympia, a tradition that honored the Queen of the Gods just as the Olympics honored her husband Zeus. The ethos that underpinned the early Olympic Games was a complex fusion of religious piety and an intense, almost agonistic, drive for individual glory. The Greek word for a contest is agon, which is the root of our words agony and protagonist. To the Greeks, competition was not a pastime. It was a central and defining feature of life. The desire to be the best, to prove one's arete, excellence, and win kleos, fame, was a powerful cultural force. The Olympics provided the ultimate stage for this agon. An athlete did not compete for his city-state in the modern sense of representing a nation. He competed for himself, for his own honor, and that of his family. The victory was personal, yet this individualistic drive was contained within a deeply religious framework. The athlete's performance was itself an offering to Zeus. His physical perfection and his supreme effort were a tribute to the gods who had blessed him with his ability. Before competing, every athlete had to swear an oath before a fearsome statue of Zeus Horkios, Zeus of the Oaths, who was depicted holding a thunderbolt in each hand. They swore that they had followed the training rules, that they would compete fairly, and that they would not resort to cheating or bribery. Any who broke this oath faced not only fines and disgrace, but divine retribution. This sacred dimension elevated the competition from a mere sporting event to a ritual performance, where physical prowess was a form of worship. As we look back at the sanctuary before the full flowering of the classical age, we see a place in transition, a crucible where the foundational elements of the Western sporting tradition were being forged. Olympia was a place of profound paradoxes. It was a site of sacred peace, yet it celebrated the skills of the warrior. It fostered a sense of Panhellenic unity, yet it was driven by the intense rivalry of individuals and city-states. It awarded a prize of no material worth, yet victory brought unparalleled wealth and honor. The sanctuary's power lay in its ability to hold these contradictory forces in a delicate, ritualized balance. It took the most primal human instincts, the drive for dominance, the desire for glory, the fear of death, and channeled them into a recurring, predictable, and beautiful festival. The early Olympia was not a city, not a stadium, but an idea that physical excellence was a form of worship, that competition could be a path to honor rather than bloodshed, and that for a few sacred days every 4 years, the scattered, warring peoples of Greece could come together as one, under the watchful gaze of the gods. This was the sacred soil from which the Olympic spirit first grew. The dawn of the 5th century before our era marked a turning point for the Hellenic world, and with it for the sacred sanctuary of Olympia. The scattered city-states, so often consumed by their own rivalries, had found a rare and fragile unity in the face of an existential threat: the colossal invading armies of the Persian Empire. Against all odds, at Marathon, at Salamis, and at Plataea, they had been victorious. This triumph ushered in an era of unprecedented confidence, wealth, and cultural efflorescence, what we now call the Classical Age. It was a period that saw the flourishing of democracy in Athens, the construction of the Parthenon, and the timeless works of philosophers like Socrates and playwrights like Sophocles. This newfound spirit of confidence and prosperity echoed powerfully within the groves of the Altis. Olympia, the great Pan-Hellenic stage, transformed from a rustic sanctuary into a breathtaking architectural cortex. The games themselves, now a mature and deeply codified institution, grew in significance, becoming the ultimate expression of the Greek cultural ideal. To attend the Olympics in the age of Pericles and Phidias was to witness a civilization at the absolute peak of its self-assurance, a world where gods and mortals, art and athletics, piety and politics, all converged under the brilliant Hellenic sun. This was the zenith of Olympia, the era when the games became the grand, 5-day spectacle that would echo through eternity. The most potent and enduring symbol of this new era was the construction of the colossal Temple of Zeus, a project begun around 470 BCE and completed just over a decade later. This was a statement in stone, a declaration of pan-Hellenic gratitude and power, financed by the spoils of a local military victory by the Hellenes over their neighbours in Pisa. It was designed by a local architect named Liban of Elis, and it became the archetypal example of the Doric architectural order, the largest and most magnificent temple of its kind on the Greek mainland. Built entirely from massive blocks of local shell limestone, which were then covered in a fine white stucco of marble dust to give the appearance of pure marble, the temple was a marvel of geometric precision and imposing scale. It stood upon a massive 3-stepped platform, its perimeter defined by a powerful colonnade of 13 massive columns along its sides and 6 on its ends. Each column, over 10 meters high, was composed of several stacked drums, their surfaces carved with shallow, concave grooves, known as flutes, which enhanced their sense of height and muscularity. The temple was not just a building, it was a carefully constructed piece of propaganda, a monument that proclaimed the victory of Greek order, reason, and civilization over the perceived chaos and tyranny of the barbarian world, embodied by the recently defeated Persians. It was a thank-offering to Zeus for their salvation, and a timeless monument to their own glory. The true genius of the Temple of Zeus, however, lay not just in its architecture, but in the magnificent sculptural program that adorned its exterior. The 2 great triangular pediments at either end of the roof were filled with breathtaking, over life-size statues, depicting 2 foundational Greek myths, each conveying a powerful moral message. The east pediment, which faced the starting line of the ancient stadium, depicted a scene of tense, static stillness, the moment just before the fateful chariot race between Pelops and King Oenomus. In the center stood the imposing figure of Zeus himself, the divine arbiter, invisible to the mortal participants. To either side stood the competitors, Pelops and Oenomus, with their respective partners, Hippodamia and her mother Stera. Their chariots, horses, and attendants filled the rest of the space, their bodies contorted to fit the triangular frame. The scene is one of quiet psychological drama, the calm before the storm of action and betrayal. It served as a powerful reminder to every athlete about to compete of the sanctuary's mythic origins, the high stakes of competition, and the ever-present, watchful gaze of the god. The myth itself, with its themes of ambition, bribery, and divine consequence, was a potent warning about the moral dangers inherent in the pursuit of victory. In stark contrast to the stillness of the east pediment, the west pediment, positioned over the temple's main entrance, was a scene of explosive, violent chaos. It depicted the Centauromachy, the mythical battle between the civilized Lepiths and the half-man, half-horse centaurs. The battle erupts at the wedding feast of the Lepith king, Pirithous, where the centaurs, having become drunk, give in to their bestial nature and attempt to abduct the Lepith women and boys. The pediment captures the brutal struggle in full swing. Bodies are intertwined, faces are contorted in agony and rage, and the raw violence of the conflict is palpable. Yet, in the very center of this swirling chaos, stands the towering, serene figure of the god Apollo. With a calm, commanding gesture of his outstretched arm, he brings order to the turmoil, ensuring the victory of the Lepiths, the representatives of civilization, reason, and self-control. For any visitor entering the sanctuary, this scene was a powerful allegory for the Greek worldview. It was the timeless struggle between civilization and barbarism, between reason and passion, between order and chaos. It was a story that every Greek knew from the recent Persian wars, and it was a message to every athlete that physical strength must be guided by mental discipline, and that the beast within must be conquered to achieve true excellence. The lessons in heroic virtue continued on the panels, or metopes, that were set high above the temple's inner porches. Here, Carved in high relief were 12 panels depicting the 12 labors of the hero Heracles, beginning with his victory over the Nemean lion and culminating with his cleansing of the Augean stables, a feat performed right there in Ilies. The metopes presented a complete narrative of the hero's legendary struggles. Each panel was a self-contained drama, showing Heracles grappling with a monstrous beast or performing an impossible task. Crucially, the sculptures often depicted not the moment of violent action, but the moment just before or just after, emphasizing the hero's intelligence, endurance, and weariness. In one panel, the goddess Athena is shown gently assisting him. In another, Heracles himself holds up the sky for the Titan Atlas, his face a mask of immense strain and determination. For the athletes who viewed them, these images were a profound source of inspiration. Heracles was the ultimate Olympian, the heroic paradigm. His labors, his athlete, were the mythological prototype for their own athletic contests. The metopes served as a visual reminder that victory required not just brute strength, but also cunning, perseverance, and at times divine favor. The path to glory was a path of suffering and struggle, and in Heracles, every athlete saw the ultimate promise of that struggle: victory, renown, and ultimately divinity. But the temple, for all its external splendor, was merely the vessel for its true treasure, the culmination of Olympia's ascent to Panhellenic supremacy. Inside the dark inner chamber, the naos stood one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the colossal chryselephantine statue of Zeus, created by the most famous sculptor of the age, Phidias. After completing his work on the Parthenon in Athens, Phidias was invited to Olympia around 435 BCE to create a cult image worthy of the king of the gods. A special workshop, identical in size and orientation to the temple's inner chamber, was constructed just outside the sacred altis to allow him to work in secrecy and at the correct scale. Here he and his team of master craftsmen embarked on one of the most ambitious artistic projects in history. The technique was chryselephantine, a composite method used for the most prestigious cult statues. A massive internal armature, or framework, was built from wood and iron. This frame was then covered in meticulously carved panels of ivory to represent the god's skin, and sheets of pure beaten gold to represent his hair, beard, and robes. The result was a breathtaking vision of divine majesty, a fusion of human artistry and precious materials designed to evoke a sense of overwhelming awe. The finished statue was over 12 meters or 40 feet tall, depicting the god seated upon a magnificent throne. An ancient visitor entering the temple from the bright sunlight would have needed a moment for their eyes to adjust to the gloom, and then, as the form became clear, they would have been confronted by a sight of almost unbearable power and beauty. The god's body, crafted from the warm, luminous ivory, seemed to glow with a life of its own. His golden robes were intricately decorated with figures and animals, and his hair and beard, also of gold, cascaded down his shoulders and chest. In his right hand he held a smaller statue of Nike, the winged goddess of victory, and in his left a tall, eagle-topped scepter, the symbol of his authority. The throne itself was a masterpiece within a masterpiece, wrought from ebony, bronze, ivory, and gold, and adorned with paintings and sculptures depicting gods and heroes. Strabo, the geographer, famously remarked that if the god were to stand up, he would unroof the temple. The statue was so overwhelming, so powerfully real, that it was said that to see it once was to be changed forever, to have witnessed the true face of the divine. For the athletes, swearing their oath before the games, the presence of this statue would have been an unforgettable and intimidating experience. This was their judge, the ultimate arbiter of their contests, the magnificent, terrifying, and awe-inspiring embodiment of Zeus Olympius himself. By this golden age, the Olympic festival had settled into a canonical 5-day program. The entire affair began not at Olympia, but in the nearby city-state of Ilias, where all competing athletes were required to gather a month before the games. This 30-day period was a mandatory training and acclimatization session, overseen directly by the 10 Hellenodici judges. It was an intense period of supervised diet, exercise, and constant evaluation. It served as a final filter, weeding out those who were not of the highest caliber, and ensuring that all competitors were fully aware of the stringent rules of each event. At the end of this month, the great procession began. The judges, the athletes, and their trainers would embark on a 2-day, 58-kilometer journey on foot along the sacred way, from Ilus to Olympia. This procession was itself a solemn ritual, a pilgrimage that built a sense of shared purpose and anticipation. Upon arriving at the sanctuary, which was already teeming with tens of thousands of spectators, merchants, and dignitaries who had set up a sprawling tent city, the athletes would spend the rest of the day in purification rites and private sacrifices, preparing themselves mentally and spiritually for the immense challenge ahead. The first official day of the festival was dedicated entirely to ritual and administration, setting a deeply religious tone for the events to follow. There were no athletic contests. The morning was dominated by the great swearing-in ceremony. The athletes, their trainers, and the judges would proceed to the Boulaterion, the council house which contained a fearsome statue of Zeus Hawkios, Zeus of the Oaths, depicted holding a thunderbolt in each hand. Standing before this statue, over the entrails of a sacrificed boar, each competitor had to swear a solemn oath. They swore that they were of free-born Greek descent, that they had committed no crimes, and that they had strictly followed the 30-day training requirement. They further swore that they would compete with honor and would not resort to bribery or any form of cheating. After the athletes, the judges themselves swore an oath to be fair and incorruptible. This was the most sacred moment of the games, a binding contract made directly with the god. The rest of the day was filled with offerings at the various altars throughout the Altis, particularly at the Pelopion and the great ash altar of Zeus. It was also a day for intellectual and artistic display. Philosophers, poets, and historians would take advantage of the great Panhellenic gathering to deliver speeches and recitations, turning Olympia into a vibrant marketplace of ideas. The second day of the festival began with the thundering sound of hooves. This day was devoted to the equestrian events, which took place in the Hippodrome, a vast, open racetrack located to the south of the stadium. These were the sports of the aristocracy, the domain of the fabulously wealthy. The premier event was the Tethrypon, the 4-horse chariot race. This was a spectacle of pure adrenaline and danger. As many as 40 chariots, light, two-wheeled contraptions, would line up at the start. At the signal, they would explode into motion, creating a deafening roar of hooves and wheels and a blinding cloud of dust. The race consisted of 12 laps around the track, with sharp 180-degree turns around a post, the Nyssa, at each end. These turns were the sites of horrific carnage. Chariots would become entangled, wheels would shatter, and drivers would be thrown to the ground, often to be trampled by the horses behind them. The owner of the winning chariot, who was often watching from a position of safety and honor, received the olive crown, a system that allowed the elite to gain immense prestige without risking their own lives. Following the Tethrypon was the Kellers, a frantic bareback horse race, and later, a 2-horse chariot race, the Sonora. For the thousands of spectators packed along the embankments of the Hippodrome, this was the most thrilling and high-stakes day of the festival, a potent display of wealth, power, and spectacular danger. Day 3 was the religious and athletic centerpiece of the festival. The morning was dedicated to the pentathlon, the contest designed to find the most complete, all-around athlete. The 5 events tested a perfect balance of skills. It began with the graceful and powerful discus throw, where athletes would hurl heavy bronze discs, their form and technique as important as their strength. Next came the long jump, a uniquely Greek event performed with the aid of stone or lead halters, which athletes swung to propel themselves further. This was followed by the javelin throw, a test of accuracy and distance derived from the skills of the hunter and soldier. After these field events, the athletes competed in the stadium foot race. The final and decisive event was wrestling. Only the top performers from the preceding events qualified for this final stage, where they would grapple under the hot sun until a single champion was left standing. The pentathlete was thus a paragon of balanced excellence, possessing speed, strength, grace, and endurance. The afternoon of the third day saw the festival's main religious event, the Great Hecatomb, the sacrifice of 100 oxen at the ash altar of Zeus. In a grand procession, the animals were led through the Altis, their horns gilded, before being ritually slaughtered. The thigh bones were wrapped in fat and burned on the altar, the rising smoke carrying the offering to the heavens, while the rest of the meat was prepared for the great feast to come. The fourth day was the day of raw primal, physical contact. It was dedicated to the so-called heavy events and the final foot races. The morning began with the 3 combat sports held in the open air of the stadium. First was boxing, the brutal contest of attrition, where fighters with leather-wrapped fists fought until one was knocked out or submitted. This was followed by the most violent sport of all, the pancration, meaning all power. This was a terrifying hybrid of boxing and wrestling with only two rules: no biting and no eye gouging. Kicking, strangling, and joint locking were all permitted. It was the ancient world's ultimate fighting championship, and its victors were revered with an almost godlike status for their near-superhuman toughness. After the brutal pancration, the mood shifted to pure wrestling, the third and final heavy event, where skill and leverage were paramount. After these grueling contests, the afternoon was given over to the last of the foot races. The stadium was run again, though the main prize had already been awarded on day one. This was followed by the dialos, the two-staged race, and finally the visually striking hoplitodroma. In this race, athletes would run two stades wearing a bronze helmet, greaves, and carrying a heavy wooden and bronze shield. It was a final, powerful reminder of the military origins of athletic competition, a tribute to the citizen soldier who was the backbone of the Greek polis. The fifth and final day was one of celebration, honor, and conclusion. There were no more contests. In the morning, all the victors from the preceding days gathered in a grand procession. Adorned with ribbons and acclaimed by the crowds, they made their way to the magnificent temple of Zeus. There, in a solemn ceremony held on the temple steps, the olive crowns were awarded. The Hellenodikai, seated on thrones of ivory, would place the kytinos, the simple wreath of sacred olive leaves, upon the head of each victor. This was the moment of ultimate glory, the culmination of years of training and a lifetime of ambition. Though the prize had no material worth, its symbolic value was immeasurable. Following the coronation, the festival concluded with a massive public feast. The meat from the 100 oxen sacrificed the day before was distributed among the athletes, officials, and their entourages. It was a time of joyous celebration, of songs, poems, and sacrifices of thanks at the various private altars. As the sun began to set on the final day, the vast crowds would begin to disperse. The athletes, now heroes, would begin their triumphant journeys home, where they would be received with unprecedented honor. The tent city would be dismantled, the sanctuary would quiet down, and Olympia would return to its slumber for another 4 years, its sacred purpose fulfilled once again. For the tens of thousands of ordinary people who made the arduous journey to Olympia, the experience was an unforgettable immersion in the very heart of their culture. Spectators were not passive consumers of entertainment. They were active participants in a religious festival. The journey itself could take weeks, often on foot through rugged and dangerous territory, a pilgrimage made possible only by the sacred truce. Upon arrival, they would find not a modern city with hotels and amenities, but a massive, chaotic, and temporary camp. They slept in tents or in the open air. Sanitation was non-existent, the summer heat was often oppressive, and the dust kicked up by the crowds was inescapable. The noise would have been constant, a cacophony of different Greek dialects, the hawking of merchants selling food, wine, and religious trinkets, the sounds of sacrificial animals, and the roar of the crowds from the stadium. Yet, despite the discomfort, or perhaps because of it, the experience was profound. It was a chance to feel for a brief time a part of something larger than their own small city-state. It was a vibrant, sprawling, Pan-Hellenic melting pot, a place to see the greatest athletes, hear the greatest minds, and feel the pulse of the entire Greek world. Watching the athletic events themselves was a raw and visceral experience. The stadium was a simple, sloping embankment of earth, with no seats. Spectators, estimated at over 40,000, would sit or stand on the grassy slopes under the full force of the sun. Married women were famously forbidden from attending, on pain of death, though the priestess of Demeter, Chamin, an ancient earth goddess, was given a place of honor. The proximity to the athletes was immediate and unfiltered. The spectators would watch the naked competitors, their bodies glistening with olive oil, as they pushed themselves to the absolute limits of human endurance. They would see the grace of the discus thrower, the explosive power of the leinter, the agony of the long-distance runner, and the brutal reality of the boxer's craft. The crowd was not quiet. They would cheer for favorites, shout encouragement, and loudly voice their disapproval of any perceived cowardice or unfairness. They were part of the spectacle, their energy fueling the competitors in the arena. To be in the stadium at Olympia was to be part of a communal ritual, a shared celebration of physical beauty, athletic struggle, and the pursuit of human excellence in its purest form. This celebration of the physical was deeply connected to the core philosophical ideals of the classical age. The concept of kolokagathia was central. This was the belief that physical excellence and beauty, kolokus, were the outward manifestation of inner moral and spiritual virtue. Agathos, a beautiful body, was considered a sign of a good soul. The Olympic victor, with his perfectly trained physique and his demonstrated courage and discipline, was seen as the living embodiment of this ideal. He was not just a great athlete, he was a great man, a model citizen, a human being who had achieved a harmonious balance of body and mind. This idea infused the games with a profound sense of moral purpose. The training of the body was not seen as a frivolous pursuit, it was an ethical duty, a way of honoring the gods and improving the self. The gymnasium where athletes trained was not just a place for exercise but also a school for philosophy and civic virtue, where older men would mentor the young in matters of both physical and moral development. This ideal was forged in the crucible of the agon, the contest or struggle that the Greeks believed was the true measure of a man. Life itself was seen as a series of struggles: the soldier's struggle in battle, the citizen's struggle in the political assembly, the philosopher's struggle for truth. The athletic agon was the purest and most symbolic of these contests. It was a voluntary, ritualized struggle with clear rules and a definitive outcome. In the stadium, an athlete faced his opponent, but he also faced his own limitations, his own pain, and his own fear. To push through these barriers, to endure the agony of the race, or the brutality of the fight, was to achieve a kind of victory that went far beyond simply defeating an opponent. It was a victory over the self. This is why the Greeks celebrated not just the winner, but the struggle itself. The focus on individual competition, with no team events, reinforced this. At Olympia, a man stood alone, his success or failure a direct result of his own arete, his own excellence, honed through years of dedicated, painful struggle. The public nudity of the athletes was a physical manifestation of these philosophical ideals. To the non-Greek world, the practice of exercising and competing naked was bizarre and deeply shocking. But for the Greeks, it was a statement of cultural identity and a celebration of the human form. It signified a rationalist worldview, a belief in the beauty and perfection of the human body as the measure of all things. The naked athlete was a living sculpture, his muscles and form on public display, a testament to his years of training and discipline. It also represented a kind of democratic ideal. Stripped of fine clothes or armor, all competitors were rendered equal. A nobleman and a commoner stood on the starting line with nothing to distinguish them but the quality of their physical condition. It was a radical statement of meritocracy, where status was earned through achievement, not birthright. This celebration of the body, this fusion of the aesthetic and the athletic, was a uniquely Hellenic innovation, and the Olympic Stadium was its grandest stage. As the classical period drew to a close with the devastating Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, the nature of the games began a slow but perceptible shift. The old ideal of the gentleman athlete competing solely for honor began to be replaced by a new reality of rampant professionalism. Athletes began to demand huge appearance fees and cash prizes from their home cities, and the concept of agon as a noble struggle was slowly eroded by the more practical concerns of earning a living. The political neutrality of Olympia was also shattered. The sanctuary became a stage for overt political propaganda and score settling. The Hellenes, guardians of the sanctuary, banned the Spartans from participating for a time. The Athenian general Alcibiades entered 7 chariot teams at once in a flagrant display of personal and national wealth, a move that was more about political posturing than athletic competition. The seeds of decline were sown, the perfect fragile balance that had defined the classical games, the balance between religion and competition, between honor and reward, between unity and rivalry, was beginning to come apart. The zenith had been reached, and the long, slow descent was about to begin. No golden age lasts forever. The sublime equilibrium that defined the classical Olympics, the delicate balance between piety and competition, honor and glory, individual achievement and Panhellenic unity, was a fragile miracle. Its slow unraveling began not with a foreign invasion, but with a creeping sickness from within. The Peloponnesian War, the ruinous, decades-long civil war that pitted Athens against Sparta, left the Greek world exhausted, cynical, and spiritually wounded. The unquestioned confidence of the Persian War victors gave way to an age of doubt and pragmatism. This profound shift in the collective Greek psyche inevitably seeped into the sacred groves of Olympia. The sanctuary, once a symbol of shared identity and sacred peace, increasingly became a stage for bitter political theatre, and the athletes themselves began a slow transformation from citizen heroes into something far more modern and complicated: the professional sportsman. The story of the games in the centuries that followed the classical Zenith is one of immense change, a gradual drift from the sacred to the secular, and the slow, inexorable process by which the soul of the Olympics was placed in a beautiful but gilded cage. The most significant internal change was the death of the amateur ideal and the rise of the professional athlete. In the early days, competitors were landowners, aristocrats who had the leisure time to train and the resources to travel. They competed for kleos, for glory, and the symbolic olive crown was their ultimate goal. But as the games grew in prestige, so did the rewards awaiting a victor back in his home city. A victory at Olympia brought such immense honor to a polis that cities began to actively recruit and subsidize promising athletes, offering them huge cash prizes, free meals for life, tax exemptions, and lavish pensions. This created a powerful economic incentive that transformed the nature of the competition. Athletics ceased to be a feature of a well-rounded citizen's education and became a full-time, all-consuming career path. Young boys with athletic potential were now identified early and put into rigorous specialized training regimes under professional coaches. Their lives were dedicated to a single purpose: win. They traveled a circuit of games around the Greek world: the Pathian Games at Delphi, the Isthmian Games at Corinth, the Nemean Games, accumulating wealth and fame. They were the first true professional athletes in history, and their existence fundamentally altered the Olympic ethos. This professionalization led to the formation of athletic guilds or unions, particularly in the Hellenistic and Roman periods. These organizations functioned like modern sports agencies, protecting the interests of their members, negotiating appearance fees, and ensuring that prize money was paid. They maintained detailed records of victories and created a kind of professional ranking system. While this provided security for the athletes, it also commercialized the spirit of the ag. The focus shifted from the honor of a single sacred victory at Olympia to the accumulation of a lifetime record of wins. Athletes became specialists. The ideal of the pentathlete, the graceful all-rounder, faded. A man was now a boxer, or a wrestler, or a runner, and he trained exclusively for that event, pushing the boundaries of human performance, but losing the holistic ideal of kalokagathia. The art of the contest became a science. Handbooks on training, diet, and strategy were written. Coaches, masseurs, and physicians became indispensable parts of an athlete's entourage. The competitors at Olympia were no longer simply the best men from their respective cities. They were the most highly trained, most specialized, and most professionalized athletes the world had ever seen, a formidable but very different breed from the heroes of the past. The political landscape of Greece was also changing, and Olympia became a mirror for these new realities. The rise of Macedon under the brilliant and ruthless King Philip II in the mid-4th century BCE marked the end of the era of the independent city-state. Philip, whose people were regarded by many Greeks as semi-barbarians, was a master of both military force and cultural propaganda. He understood the immense symbolic power of Olympia and sought to use it to legitimize his growing dominance over Greece. The most effective way for a monarch to participate was through the chariot race, the sport of kings. Philip invested heavily in the finest breeding stables and professional drivers, and his horses won victories in the chariot race at 3 consecutive Olympiads. He minted coins celebrating these victories, broadcasting his success and his Greekness across the ancient world. A victory at Olympia was a divine endorsement, a sign that the gods favored his cause. He was no longer just a Macedonian warlord, he was an Olympic champion, a man worthy of leading the Hellenic world. Philip's ambition at Olympia was not confined to the racetrack. He cemented his presence within the sacred Altis with an unprecedented architectural statement. The Philippio, located in a prime position near the Temple of Hera, this elegant circular monument, or tholos, was a stunning piece of political self-promotion. It was built with Ionic columns on the outside and Corinthian half-columns on the inside, a showcase of the most sophisticated architectural styles, but it was the contents that were truly revolutionary. Inside, Philip placed chryselephantine gold and ivory statues of himself, his son Alexander, his wife Olympias, and his parents. This was an act of shocking audacity. Chryselephantine statues were traditionally reserved for the most important cult images of the gods, like Phidias's magnificent Zeus just a stone's throw away. By placing his own family, rendered in the materials of the gods, within the sacred precinct, Philip was blurring the line between mortal ruler and divine being. It was a claim to heroic, if not divine status, a permanent monument to his dynasty at the very heart of Pan-Hellenic Greece. The Philippione was a brilliant, but cynical piece of propaganda, a sign that Olympia was no longer just a sanctuary for the gods, but a platform for the political ambitions of powerful men. Philip's son, Alexander the Great, had a more complex and ultimately dismissive relationship with the Olympic Games. As a youth, he possessed extraordinary athletic prowess. Plutarch tells us that when asked if he would compete in the foot race at Olympia, Alexander replied, "Yes, if I were to have kings as my competitors." This famous remark reveals a profound shift in worldview. For Alexander, whose ambition was to conquer the entire known world, the ritualized symbolic agon of the stadium seemed trivial. His contest was not with other athletes for an olive crown, but with the Persian Empire for the fate of civilization. The real arena was the battlefield, and the real prize was global dominion. He respected the athletes and their skills. He was a great admirer of the legendary Pancratiast Dioxippus, but he saw their pursuits as beneath his own. He had no need for the legitimacy that an Olympic victory conferred upon his father. His legitimacy came from the spear. This attitude, coming from the most powerful figure in the Greek world, signaled that the games, while still prestigious, no longer held the absolute central importance to the elite that they once had. The world was now bigger than Greece, and the ambitions of its rulers were now global, dwarfing even the grand stage of Olympia. Following Alexander's death, his vast empire was torn apart by his generals, the Diadochi, who carved out their own Hellenistic kingdoms in Egypt, Asia, and Macedonia. These new monarchs, ruling over vast non-Greek populations, desperately needed to maintain and project their Greek cultural identity. The great Pan-Hellenic festivals, especially the Olympics, became a vital tool for this. The Ptolemaic kings of Egypt and the Seleucid kings of Asia lavishly sponsored athletes from their realms, celebrating their victories as proof of their kingdom's strength, and, more importantly, its authentic Greekness. They dedicated magnificent statues and offerings at Olympia, continuing the tradition of using the sanctuary as a billboard for their power and prestige. The games became more international than ever before, with champions coming from newly founded Greek cities in Egypt, Syria, and Asia Minor. But this internationalism came at a price. The festival was becoming unmoored from its origins in the Peloponnese, was now an instrument in the geopolitical rivalries of far-flung empires, its sacred purpose increasingly entangled with the dynastic ambitions of Alexander's successor. The olive crown was still the prize, but it was now won in the service of kings who ruled from Alexandria and Antioch. The next great power to enter the Greek world was Rome. The initial Roman encounter with the Olympics was one of cultural bewilderment. The Romans, a deeply pragmatic and militaristic people, had little understanding of the Greek passion for individual athletic competition for its own sake. Their own public spectacles, the ludi, were fundamentally different. They favored brutal, often lethal gladiatorial combat, mass chariot racing for factional teams, and grandiose triumphal parades. The Greek concept of gymnos, competing in the nude, was particularly alien to the conservative Roman sense of modesty. They viewed it as decadent and effeminate. To the Romans, an athlete was a low-class entertainer, not a citizen hero. Yet as Rome's power expanded, its leaders recognized the immense prestige and cultural significance of the Olympics. The Roman general Titus Quincius Flamininus, after defeating the Macedonians in 196 BCE, famously proclaimed the freedom of the Greeks at the Isthmian Games, cynically using a pan-Hellenic festival to establish Roman authority. The Romans were patrons, not participants, and their patronage came with a new set of rules. A dark turning point came in the 1st century BCE with the Roman general Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Engaged in a brutal war in the east, Sulla was in desperate need of funds, with a breathtaking lack of piety. He ordered the sacking of the treasuries of Greece's most sacred sanctuaries, including both Delphi and Olympia. The immense wealth of accumulated offerings, gold, silver, bronze, and ivory, was melted down to pay his legion. It was a profound violation of the sanctuary's sanctity, a demonstration that the sacred truce and the protection of Zeus meant nothing in the face of Roman military power. But Sulla's desecration did not end there. In 80 BCE, he took his narcissism a step further, by attempting to move the entire Olympic Games to Rome, to celebrate his own victories. The 17th Olympiad was a ghost event at Olympia. Only the boys' foot races were held, while the main athletic events were staged in the Roman capital. The attempt was a failure, and the Games returned to Olympia in the next cycle. But the damage was done. Sulla's actions had demonstrated that the Games' very existence was now subject to the whims of their new Roman master. Olympia was no longer the independent heart of the Greek world. It was a venerable but subservient institution in a Roman world. The dawn of the Roman Empire under Augustus brought a period of peace and stability. The Pax Romana, which ushered in a new final golden age for Olympia. Augustus and his successors, particularly the Philo-Hellenic Emperor Hadrian, presented themselves as patrons and protectors of Greek culture. They respected the ancient traditions of the Games and invested heavily in the sanctuary's infrastructure. New buildings were constructed, old ones were repaired, and the water supply was dramatically improved with the construction of a magnificent aqueduct and a monumental fountain, the Nymphaeum of Herodes Atticus. This lavish semicircular monument, sponsored by an incredibly wealthy Greek-Roman senator in the 2nd century CE, was adorned with statues of his family and the imperial household, continuing the tradition of elite self-promotion at the sanctuary. The Games flourished during this period. The network Roman roads made travel easier and safer than ever before, and Olympia became a premier tourist destination, drawing crowds and competitors from every corner of the vast empire. Roman citizens, now able to claim a kind of honorary Greek identity, began to compete and win. The festival was prosperous, popular, and well managed, a jewel in the crown of the Roman Empire. Yet this Roman revival was, in many ways, a hollow one. The Games had become part of a much larger, empire-wide circuit of professional athletic competitions, known as the period. A successful athlete was an itinerant professional, traveling from city to city, from Ephesus to Alexandria to Rome, competing for cash prizes. Olympia, while still the most prestigious, was now just one stop, albeit the most important one on the tour. The unique religious solemnity of the festival was diluted. It was now more of a grand spectacle, a piece of imperial cultural heritage, than a deeply felt religious experience. The Roman influence also brought with it a taste for greater brutality. While gladiatorial combat was never officially part of the Olympic program, the ethos of the arena began to infect the old Games. The combat sports, particularly boxing and the pancration, became even more violent, with some fighters gaining fame for killing their opponent. The delicate balance was gone. The Games were now primarily about entertainment, a grand public spectacle sponsored by the emperor and enjoyed by the masses. The original spirit of the agon as a sacred struggle for honor had given way to the Roman demand for thrilling and often bloody spectacle. The ultimate perversion of the Olympic ideal occurred in 67 CE, during the reign of the notoriously narcissistic Emperor Nero. A passionate Philhellene, Nero embarked on a grand tour of Greece, and he was determined to become an Olympic champion. He ordered the 4 main Panhellenic Games to be compressed into a single year so he could compete in them all, and he forced the Hellenes to hold the Olympics 2 years out of schedule to coincide with his visit. He introduced new events in which he was certain to excel, such as competitions for heralds and tragedy, as well as lyre singing. The judges, terrified of the emperor, had no choice but to award him the victory in every event he entered. The most farcical moment came during the 4-horse chariot race. Nero, an inexperienced driver, lost control of his 10-horse chariot and was thrown to the ground. Despite being unable to complete the race, he was still declared the winner. The ancient chronicles state that he was awarded over 1,900 victory crowns during his tour of Greece. It was a grotesque parody of competition, a moment when the absolute power of a Roman emperor completely subjugated the sacred traditions of Olympia. After Nero's death, his victories were officially nullified by the Hellene authorities, but the event left an indelible stain, a clear demonstration of how far the games had fallen from their origin. Despite the Neronian farce, the games continued to thrive for another 2 centuries, a testament to their enduring appeal and the stability of the Roman Empire. Athletes with Roman names became common on the victor lists, and the festival settled into a comfortable, if less spiritually profound, routine. However, the wider world was changing in ways that would ultimately prove fatal to the ancient festival. The crisis of the 3rd century CE saw the Roman Empire racked by civil war, economic collapse, and barbarian invasions. The vast resources needed to maintain the sanctuary at Olympia and to stage the grand festival began to dry up. In 26-7 CE, the Heruli, a Germanic tribe, swept through Greece, leaving a trail of destruction. Although they did not destroy Olympia, the threat was so severe that the Hellenes were forced to construct a defensive wall around the sanctuary's core. In a deeply symbolic act of desecration, they used the collapsed and damaged blocks from the magnificent buildings within the Altis, including the stadium and the gymnasium, as building materials for their new wall. The sanctuary, once an open and welcoming space, protected by a sacred truce, was now a fortified garrison, its treasures cannibalized for its own defense. The world outside was no longer safe, and the pan-Hellenic ideal of peaceful gathering was a distant memory. The final ideological poison that would kill the ancient Olympics was the rise of a new religion, Christianity. From its origins as a persecuted sect, Christianity grew exponentially within the Roman Empire, and its worldview was fundamentally incompatible with the Olympic Games. To the early church fathers, the Games were a quintessential pagan festival, a celebration dedicated to a false and demonic god, Zeus. The entire ritual framework, the sacrifices, the oaths, the hero worship, was seen as idolatry of the worst kind. The Greek focus on the perfection of the physical body was viewed as a form of vanity that distracted from the care of the immortal soul. The athletic nudity that had been a hallmark of the Games for a millennium was condemned as a source of lust and immoral temptation. As Christianity became more powerful, its opposition to the Games hardened. They were seen as a symbol of the old, sinful, pagan world that had to be swept away to make room for a new Christian society. The clash was not between 2 competing athletic traditions, but between 2 entirely different ways of understanding humanity's place in the cosmos. The end came swiftly and decisively. In 380 CE, the Emperor Theodosius I made Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This was the beginning of the end for all forms of pagan worship. A series of decrees were issued, withdrawing financial support from pagan cults and ordering the closure of temples. The final, definitive blow came in 3093 CE, when Theodosius, likely under the influence of the powerful and staunchly anti-pagan Bishop Ambrose of Milan, issued a comprehensive edict that banned all pagan festivals, rituals and sacrifices. While the Olympic Games were not mentioned by name, the sweeping nature of the ban meant that the festival, as a religious event honoring Zeus, was now illegal. The 2093 Olympiad of 3093 CE is traditionally held to be the last. After more than 1,000 years of continuous celebration, the sacred flame at Olympia was extinguished. The edict was not just a political act. It was the final victory of one worldview over another, the culmination of a long process of decline and transformation that had begun centuries earlier. The immediate aftermath of the ban was one of neglect and decay. The sanctuary, now stripped of its religious function and its economic engine, was abandoned. The magnificent chryselephantine statue of Zeus was, according to one Byzantine historian, removed from the temple and transported to a palace in Constantinople, the new capital of the empire, where it was later destroyed in a fire. The great bronze statues that filled the Altis were likely melted down for their valuable metal. The site itself fell victim to the forces of both man and nature. In 4026 CE, the Emperor Theodosius II ordered the destruction of all remaining pagan temples, and the Temple of Zeus was likely deliberately set on fire and burned. What man did not destroy, nature did. A series of powerful earthquakes in the 6th century CE toppled the remaining columns and shattered the temple. The river Alpheos, no longer managed by human hands, changed its course and flooded the site, while its tributary, the Clerdios, washed down immense quantities of sand and silt from the hills. Slowly but surely, the entire sanctuary, its temples, its treasuries, its stadium, its memory, was buried under a thick blanket of earth, in some places up to 8 meters deep. Olympia vanished from the world, its location eventually forgotten, its glorious history relegated to the pages of obscure ancient texts. The long sleep had begun. Looking back on this extended period of transformation from the late 5th century BCE to the 5th century CE, we see a story of cultural assimilation and eventual extinction. The Olympic Games, born from a uniquely Hellenic set of values, demonstrated a remarkable capacity for adaptation. They survived the collapse of the polis, the rise of Macedon, and the conquest of Rome. They adapted to the demands of professionalism, the ambitions of kings, and the administrative needs of emperors. Each new era left its mark, adding a layer of complexity and often a layer of cynicism. The Hellenistic kings turned the games into a tool of dynastic propaganda. The Romans repurposed them as imperial spectacle and tourist attraction. But through it all, something of the original core remained. The 4-year cycle, the olive crown, the fame of victory. Yet, this adaptability could not save them from the final irresistible force of a new exclusive monotheism. The Christian worldview could not absorb or co-opt the Olympic festival as the Romans had. It could only abolish it. The closing of the sanctuary at Olympia was more than just the end of an athletic event. It was the closing of a chapter in human thought, the definitive end of the ancient world and the religious and cultural landscape that had sustained it for over 1,000 years. The ultimate irony is that the very forces that destroyed Olympia also ensured its preservation. The violent earthquakes that toppled the temples and the thick layers of river silt that buried the site created a protective cocoon. Unlike Rome, which was continuously inhabited and plundered for its building materials, Olympia was simply wiped off the map and sealed away. It lay dormant and untouched for over 1,300 years, a complete, self-contained world waiting to be rediscovered. The stories of its former glory survived in the texts of writers like Pausanias, who wrote a detailed travel guide to the sanctuary in the 2nd century CE. But the physical reality was gone. The world forgot where Olympia was. The sacred ground that had once been the beating heart of the Hellenic world was now nothing more than quiet farmland, its buried treasures and epic history sleeping soundly beneath the olive groves, waiting for a new age, a new kind of humanism to seek them out and bring their echoes back to life. The long night of the sanctuary was also its salvation, a period of quiet incubation before its improbable rebirth in the modern era. For over 1,000 years, Olympia slept. The sanctuary that had been the beating heart of the Hellenic world lay silent, entombed beneath meters of river silt and its own magnificent rubble. The great temple of Zeus, the echoing stadium, the workshop of Phidias, all were gone, erased from the physical landscape as if they had been but a dream. The memory of the games survived, but only as faint whispers in the fragile pages of ancient texts, preserved in the scriptoria of monasteries and the libraries of scholars who had never seen the sacred valley. The world moved on, empires rose and fell, new faiths conquered the old, and the idea of a grand festival, celebrating physical prowess in honor of a pagan god, seemed like an artifact from a remote and alien past. But ideas are more resilient than stone. While the physical body of Olympia lay buried, its spirit, its logos, was merely dormant. The story of the modern Olympic Games begins not with a starting pistol, but with the quiet turning of a page, with the intellectual spark of the Renaissance, and the humanistic quest to rediscover the lost glories of the classical world. It is the story of a dream, passed from scholar to poet, from antiquarian to philanthropist, and finally to a determined French baron who would, against all odds, breathe life back into the ghost of Olympia. The first glimmers of this rebirth can be traced to the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance in the 15th century. As scholars and artists in Italy began to unearth the lost literature and art of antiquity, they rediscovered the Greek ideal of humanity. They moved away from the medieval focus on original sin and the afterlife, and turned towards a celebration of human potential, reason, and earthly achievement. In the newly recovered works of authors like Plato, Plutarch, and Lucian, they rid of a world where the training of the body was not a source of shame but a moral duty, and where physical beauty was seen as a reflection of a virtuous soul. They learned of the gymnasium, a place for both physical and intellectual development, and of the great Pan-Hellenic Games, This rediscovery of the classical worldview planted a seed. The concept of the Olympics became a powerful symbol of this lost golden age, a time when humanity seemed more integrated, more heroic, and more in harmony with itself. While no one yet knew the precise location of the buried sanctuary, the Olympia of the mind became a potent ideal for Renaissance humanists, a utopian vision of a more perfect and complete way of being. This intellectual fascination deepened during the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. The philosophical emphasis on reason, liberty, and the rights of man found a powerful precedent in the democratic city-states of ancient Greece. Thinkers of the age, from Rousseau to Winckelmann, looked to the Greeks as models of political and aesthetic perfection. Joachim Winckelmann, the German art historian, was particularly influential. His writings on Greek sculpture, characterized by noble simplicity and quiet grandeur, helped to create a fervent new appreciation for classical art. He wrote of the naked Greek athlete as the pinnacle of human beauty, this form perfected by exercise and celebrated in a climate of freedom. This wave of Philhellenism, or love of all things Greek, created an intellectual climate where the revival of the Olympic Games could be seriously contemplated for the first time. It was no longer just a forgotten historical event. It was a cultural ideal, a potential antidote to the perceived ills of modern society. The idea began to percolate that if one could revive the Games, one might also revive the spirit of civic virtue and human excellence that they represented. The dream began to take on a more tangible, physical form in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with the rise of the Grand Tour and the birth of modern archaeology. Wealthy young European aristocrats, as part of their education, would travel to Italy and Greece to experience the ruins of antiquity firsthand. This led to a more systematic, if still amateur, exploration of the classical world. In 1766, the English antiquarian Richard Chandler, armed with a careful reading of Pausanias's ancient travel guide, became the first person in modern times to correctly identify the location of the lost sanctuary of Olympia. He recognized the landscape from the ancient descriptions, standing between two rivers at the foot of the hill of Cronus, and saw the ruins of a temple, which we now know was the Temple of Zeus. Chandler's discovery put Olympia back on the map, transforming it from a literary ghost into a physical place, a tangible destination for scholars and explorers. Though his work was limited to surface observation, he had opened the door. The sleeping giant had been found, and the first steps towards its excavation had been taken. The first tentative efforts to revive the Games themselves emerged not from Greece but from the unlikely setting of Much Wenlock, a small market town in the English county of Shropshire. Here in 1850, a local physician named Dr. William Penny Brooks founded the Wenlock Olympian class, with the ambitious aim of promoting the moral, physical, and intellectual improvement of the inhabitants. Brooks was a passionate classicist and a social reformer, deeply influenced by the ideals of the ancient Greek. He believed that physical exercise was essential for the health and well-being of the working classes. The Wenlock Olympian Games, held annually, were a quirky but heartfelt mix of ancient and modern events. They included classic track and field events like running and jumping, alongside traditional English country sports like tilting at a ring on horseback, cricket, and even a wheelbarrow race. The winners were crowned with wreaths and the proceedings were filled with a great deal of pageantry, including a procession of flag-bearers and officials. Brooks's vision was both local and international. He campaigned tirelessly for the introduction of physical education in English schools and dreamed of reviving the official Olympic Games in their original home, even petitioning the Greek government on the matter. The Wenlock Games were a small, provincial affair, but their spirit was grand and they would prove to be a vital link in the chain of Olympic revival. At the same time, a similar movement was stirring in Greece itself. Following its hard-won independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1832, the fledgling Greek nation was searching for ways to reconnect with its glorious ancient past and forge a modern national identity. One of the key figures in this movement was Evangelos Zappos, a wealthy and patriotic Greek merchant who had made his fortune in Romania. Zappos was a fervent believer in the power of the Olympic ideal to inspire his countrymen. In 1856, he wrote to King Otto of Greece, offering a vast sum of money to fund a permanent, modern revival of the Olympic Games. Despite some initial government resistance, Zappos's offer was eventually accepted. The first of these Zappos Olympics was held in a public square in Athens. The event was chaotic and poorly organized, with an overwhelming number of participants and unruly crowds. But the dream had been rekindled on Greek soil. Zappos continued to fund the project, and subsequent games were held in 1870 and 1875 in the newly restored Panathenaic Stadium, the magnificent all-marble stadium of antiquity. Zappos's will also provided the funds to build a grand exhibition hall near the stadium, the Zappeion, which was intended to serve the needs of the revived games and stands today as his lasting legacy. While the Zappos Olympics ultimately fizzled out due to organizational difficulties, they were a crucial step, a full-scale attempt to bring the games back to life in their homeland nearly 4 decades before the official eight. While these early revivals were taking place, the world's attention was drawn back to the buried sanctuary itself. The first major excavation at Olympia was undertaken by the French Expédition Scientifique de Marie. This was a team of scholars and scientists who accompanied French troops sent to support the Greek War of Independence. They spent 6 weeks at the site and, working with a large team of local laborers, were able to definitively identify the Temple of Zeus. They uncovered several fragments of the temple's magnificent sculptures from the metatopes, including depictions of the labors of Heracles. These fragments were shipped back to Paris and put on display at the Louvre Museum, where they caused a sensation. For the first time, the European public could see for themselves the sublime artistry that had adorned the great temple. The French expedition was more of a treasure hunt than a scientific excavation, and their removal of the sculptures was controversial, but their work provided a tantalizing glimpse of the wonders that still lay hidden beneath the silt, fueling the desire for a more comprehensive and systematic exploration of the site. That great work would fall to the Germans. The driving force was a brilliant and passionate classical scholar named Ernst Curtius. From a young age, Curtius had been obsessed with Olympia, and he spent decades lobbying the German government and academic institutions for the funds to mount a full-scale scientific excavation. A crucial breakthrough came in 1874 when he secured the backing of the German Crown Prince Frederick William and negotiated a landmark agreement with the Greek government. This agreement was a model for modern archaeological ethics. In a radical departure from the common practice of the time, Germany agreed that all of the artifacts discovered at Olympia would remain the property of Greece. In return, Germany was granted the exclusive right to excavate the site and to make plaster casts and copies of the finds for its own museums. This was a treaty founded on mutual respect for national heritage, and it set a new standard for international scientific collaboration. In the autumn of 1875, Curtius and his team of archaeologists, architects and draftsmen finally broke ground. The great German excavation of Olympia had begun. The task facing Curtius and his team was monumental. The entire central sanctuary was buried under a thick, heavy blanket of alluvial sand and silt, several meters deep. The logistical challenges were immense. They had to organize a workforce of hundreds of local laborers, build a small railway to cart away the enormous quantities of earth, and meticulously document everything they found. The work was slow and painstaking, but as the layers of earth were peeled back, the lost world of Olympia began to re-emerge into the sunlight for the first time in over a millennium. They uncovered the foundations of the Temple of Zeus, confirming the work of the earlier French expedition. They unearthed the treasuries of the various city-states, the magnificent Temple of Hera, and the echoes of the great ash altar. They traced the outlines of the gymnasium and the palæstra, the training grounds of the athlete, and they found the workshop of the master sculptor Phidias, its floors still littered with the tools, molds and scraps of ivory and colored glass used in the creation of the great chryselephantine statue of Zeus, a discovery that stunningly confirmed the accuracy of Pausanias's ancient account. One of the most thrilling discoveries came in 1877, within the ruins of the Temple of Hera. There, lying in the rubble, where it had fallen, was one of the undisputed masterpieces of all classical sculpture, the statue of the god Hermes holding the infant Dionysus, an original work by the 4th century master Praxiteles. The statue, carved from Parian marble, was in a remarkable state of preservation. The sensuous, S-shaped curve of Hermes's body, the subtle modeling of his muscles, and the sublime, polished finish of the marble represented a pinnacle of Greek artistry. The discovery caused an international sensation, cementing the reputation of the German excavation and reinforcing the cultural importance of the site. Another key discovery was the unearthing of the stadium itself. The archaeologists were able to trace the original stone starting and finishing lines, allowing them to calculate the precise length of the ancient stadium race. They uncovered the judges' stand on the embankments where 40,000 spectators once sat. Standing in the excavated stadium, it was possible, for the first time in 1500 years, to feel a direct physical connection to the ancient athletes and the sacred contests they had performed on that very ground. The German excavation was a triumph of scientific archaeology, resurrecting not just artifacts but the entire layout and context of the sacred sanctuary. It was into this world, electrified by the rediscovery of ancient Olympia, that the central figure of the modern revival, Baron Pierre de Coubertin, was born. A French aristocrat and intellectual, Coubertin grew up in the shadow of France's humiliating defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 18. He became convinced that the reason for his country's failure was not military or political, but educational and moral. He believed the youth of France had become soft and decadent, and that a national regeneration could only be achieved through a renewed emphasis on physical education and sport. He looked to other cultures for models. He was deeply impressed by the muscular Christianity of the English public school system, particularly as espoused by Thomas Arnold of Rugby School, where sport was used to build character, discipline, and a sense of fair play. He saw organized sport as a new kind of religion, a way to cultivate moral and social strength. His quest was not initially about international competition, but about reforming the French educational system. Coubertin's vision began to crystallize into a more ambitious, international form through two key encounters. First, he learned about the archaeological discoveries being made at Olympia. The reports and images coming from the German excavation captivated him, providing a powerful, historical precedent for his own belief in the connection between sport, art, and moral education. The ancient games represented a perfect, holistic ideal that he sought to emulate. The second, and perhaps most crucial, influence was his discovery of the Wenlock Olympian Games. In 1890, Coubertin travelled to Much Wenlock and met with the elderly Dr. William Penny Brooks. He was profoundly inspired by what he saw. In the humble English town, he witnessed a living, breathing festival that, despite its modest scale, embodied the very Olympic spirit he had read about. He saw the pageantry, the awarding of prizes, and the genuine enthusiasm for athletic competition as a tool for community betterment. He later wrote that Brooks was an essential part of the story. The meeting with Brooks solidified Coubertin's belief that a full, international revival was not just a fanciful dream, but an achievable goal. He had seen a working model, and it gave him the final impetus to launch his own grand campaign. Coubertin was a masterful organizer and a tireless promoter. He decided to stage a grand international congress to propose his idea to the world. To ensure a good turnout, he cleverly disguised his true intention, framing the event as a congress on amateurism, a hot-button issue in the world of sport at the time. The congress was held in June 1894 at the prestigious Sorbonne in Paris. It was a carefully orchestrated piece of theatre. The halls were decorated with classical murals, and the opening ceremony featured a newly composed hymn to Apollo, supposedly rediscovered at Delphi, which lent the proceedings an air of ancient gravitas. Representatives from sporting associations across Europe and America attended. After several days of discussing the technicalities of amateur rules, Coubertin sprang his surprise. He stood up and delivered an impassioned speech, calling not just for the regulation of sport, but for the revival of the Olympic Games themselves, a modern festival of international youth, to be held every 4 years, moving between the great capitals of the world. The idea was met with enthusiastic applause. The delegates, swept up in the romantic and idealistic atmosphere, voted unanimously to resurrect the Olympic Games. The Congress immediately moved to establish the framework for this new endeavor. An International Olympic Committee, IOC, was formed to oversee the Games. In a gesture of respect to the Games' origins, a Greek delegate, Demetrios Vikelas, was elected as its first president. The next crucial decision was where to hold the inaugural Games. Coubertin himself had initially favored holding the first Games in Paris in 1900 to coincide with the Universal Exposition. But Vikelas made a passionate and persuasive argument that there could be only one conceivable location for the revival: Athens, the capital of Greece. To host the first modern Games anywhere else would be to sever them from their historical and spiritual roots. The committee agreed. The first Olympiad of the modern era would be celebrated in Athens in 1896. The dream now had a date, and a location. The news was met with excitement across Europe, but the reality on the ground in Greece was far more complicated. The Greek government was on the verge of bankruptcy, and the Prime Minister, Charilios Trikoupis, was openly hostile to the idea, seeing it as a frivolous and ruinously expensive fantasy. For a time it seemed the entire project would collapse before it even began. The fate of the first modern Olympics was saved by the determination of two men. The first was the Crown Prince of Greece, Constantine. A firm believer in the project, he defied the Prime Minister and used his royal authority to form a new organising committee, lending the Games an essential air of national prestige. The second was Georgios Averof, a wealthy Greek businessman and philanthropist who lived in Alexandria, Egypt. Following the model of Evangelos Zappos before him, Averof was inspired by the appeal to national pride. He made a colossal donation of nearly 1 million drachmas, specifically for the purpose of rebuilding the ancient Panathenaic Stadium. This was the magnificent all-marble stadium that had been used for the ancient Panathenaic Games and had been partially excavated and restored for the Zappos Olympics. Averof's donation allowed for its complete reconstruction, transforming the ancient ruin into a gleaming white marble horseshoe capable of holding over 60,000 spectators. His patronage was the decisive act that ensured the Games would have a worthy venue. The stadium itself was a powerful symbol, a direct physical link between the athletic festivals of ancient Athens and the modern Olympic revival. On April 6, 1896, before a massive and jubilant crowd packed into the newly restored Panathenaic Stadium, King George I of Greece officially declared the opening of the first international Olympic Games of the modern era. 241 athletes, all male, from 14 nations had gathered to compete. While small by modern standards, it was the largest international sporting event of its time. The athletes were not organized into official national teams, but competed as individuals or for their clubs, and many were simply tourists who happened to be in Athens and decided to enter. The atmosphere was one of good-natured enthusiasm and amateur spirit. The program of events was a mixture of ancient and modern sports, including athletics, gymnastics, wrestling, fencing, swimming, cycling and tennis. The swimming events were held in the open, frigid waters of the Bay of Zea, and the cycling events took place on a purpose-built velodrome. For 9 days, the city of Athens was consumed by Olympic fever, the Greek public embracing the event with a passion that silenced all the earlier skepticism. The competitions were filled with memorable moments. The very first champion of the modern games was an American college student from Harvard, James Connolly, who won the triple jump. He became an instant celebrity. The German wrestler and gymnast Karl Schumann became one of the most successful competitors, winning 4 events. But for the Greek hosts, one event mattered more than all the others combined: the marathon. This new race, which had never been part of the ancient games, was invented specifically for the 1896 revival by a French philologist named Michel Brier. He was inspired by the legend of the Athenian messenger Pheidippides, who was said to have run from the battlefield of Marathon to Athens to announce the Greek victory over the Persians, only to collapse and die upon delivering the news. The race was designed to be the ultimate test of endurance and to provide a narrative link to Greece's classical glory. As the race unfolded, the Greek spectators waited with breathless anxiety. News came from the course that foreign athletes were leading. A pall of gloom settled over the stadium. Then, as the leaders approached the outskirts of Athens, the story took a dramatic, almost mythical turn. A lone Greek runner, a humble water carrier from the village of Marousi, named Spiridon Louis, began to overtake his exhausted rivals. A messenger raced ahead to the stadium to announce the news. When Louis, his face etched with exhaustion, but his spirit unbroken, finally entered the Panathenaic Stadium, the entire crowd erupted in a roar of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. The Crown Prince and his brother ran down onto the track to accompany him on his final lap. His victory was more than just an athletic achievement. It was a moment of profound national catharsis. It was as if the heroic spirit of ancient Greece had been reborn in the body of a simple, modern Greek peasant. Louis became an immortal national hero, his victory single-handedly ensuring that the first modern games would be remembered as a triumphant success. His victory gave the new Olympic movement a powerful, unifying narrative, a story of how an ancient legend could inspire modern glory. The closing ceremony of the 1896 Games was a joyous affair. The winners received not gold medals, but silver ones, along with an olive branch, while the runners-up received bronze medals and a laurel branch. A sense of optimism pervaded the stadium. The games had been a resounding success, exceeding all expectations. Many prominent figures, including the Greek royal family, suggested that Athens should become the permanent home for the games, just as Olympia had been in antiquity. For a moment it seemed this might happen. However, Baron de Coubertin was adamant that his original vision of a travelling international festival must be respected. The games needed to belong to the whole world, not just to Greece. And so the IOC decided that the next Olympiad would be held, as he had originally planned, in Paris. The fragile new movement would leave its cradle and venture out into the wider, more complicated modern world. The dream had been made real, but its future was far from certain. Looking back at the 1896 Athens Games, we can see both the ancient roots and the modern echoes in sharp relief. The revival was not a simple act of historical reproduction. It was a creative reimagining. Coubertin and his fellow founders were children of their time, and they infused the games with 19th century ideals. They kept the 4-year cycle, the name, and the spirit of peaceful, international competition. They sought to revive the ideal of the honorable amateur, even as that ideal was already a nostalgic fiction. But they also made radical changes. The profound religious core of the ancient festival was completely stripped away, replaced by a secular humanism and a new religion of nationhood. The events were a mix of old and new, and the iconic marathon was a modern invention. The competitors, though amateurs, were the pioneers of a new form of international celebrity. The 1896 Games were a beautiful, hybrid creation, a bridge between two worlds. They were a testament to the enduring power of the classical ideal, but also a reflection of the nationalistic and romantic currents of their own time. The dream of Olympia was alive again, but it now had a new purpose and a new global destiny. The triumph of Athens in 1896 was a moment of pure idealistic joy, a dream made manifest in gleaming marble. For 9 days, the world had caught a glimpse of Coubertin's vision, a festival of peaceful international competition, seemingly resurrected whole from the ancient past. Yet, this successful revival was not a conclusion, but a precarious beginning. The fledgling Olympic movement, having left its Greek cradle, was about to discover that the modern world was a far more complex and unforgiving environment than the sacred groves of Olympia. The next few decades would be a trial by fire, a period of profound struggle, where the romantic dream collided with the harsh realities of industrial-era politics, commercialism, and global indifference. The journey of the modern games would not be a simple story of progress, but a tumultuous cycle of near-death experiences, stunning triumphs, and constant, often painful, reinvention. The torch had been lit, but its flame was fragile, and it would take all the determination of its guardians to keep it from being extinguished by the winds of the 20th century. The first great test came almost immediately, following the success of Athens. The second Olympiad of 1900 was awarded to Baron de Coubertin's home city of Paris. He envisioned a showcase that would solidify the Games' place on the world stage. The reality was a disaster. The Olympic Games were completely subsumed by the sprawling, chaotic spectacle of the 1900 Paris Universal Exposition. The fair's organizers had little interest in Coubertin's classical ideals, and saw the sporting events as little more than a sideshow, a minor attraction among the countless pavilions and exhibitions. The word Olympic was rarely even used in the official marketing. The competitions were spread out over 5 months, from May to October, and were so poorly organized and disconnected that many athletes reportedly competed and left Paris without ever realizing they had participated in the Olympic Games. The venues were inadequate, the scheduling was haphazard, and the events themselves ranged from the conventional to the utterly bizarre, including live pigeon shooting, kite flying, and firefighting competition. It was a humiliating experience for Coubertin, who felt his grand vision had been debased and trivialized. The Games had lost their sacred, focused identity and had become a mere footnote in a larger commercial fair. If Paris was a disappointment, the next Games, held in St. Louis in 1904, were a near-fatal fiasco that threatened to end the movement entirely. Once again, the Olympics were tethered to a World's Fair. the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. The location itself proved to be a massive hurdle. In an age before easy air travel, St. Louis was incredibly remote for most European athletes. The journey was long, arduous, and expensive. As a result, international participation was abysmal. Of the 601 athletes who competed, the vast majority were American, with many events featuring only US competitors. The Games were less of a global competition and more of an American athletics championship. The organization was chaotic, and the proceedings were marred by one of the most shameful episodes in Olympic history, the so-called Anthropology Days. In a misguided and deeply racist attempt at a scientific experiment, the fair's organizers staged a separate two-day tribal Olympics for indigenous peoples who were part of the fair's human exhibition. They were forced to compete in modern athletic events with little understanding of the rules, their performances intended to prove the athletic superiority of the white race. It was a grotesque parody of the Olympic spirit, a low point from which the movement almost did not recover. By the end of the St. Louis Games, the Olympic ideal was fading fast, its prestige shattered, and its future in serious doubt. Salvation came from an unlikely source. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius. The fourth Olympiad of 1908 was originally awarded to Rome, but a devastating volcanic eruption in 1906 forced the Italian government to divert all available funds to the reconstruction of Naples. With Rome pulling out at short notice, the Olympic movement was facing catastrophe. It was then that London stepped in. The British Olympic Association, with only 2 years to prepare, organised a festival that, despite its own share of controversies, effectively saved the game. For the first time, a purpose-built stadium at White City was constructed, complete with a swimming pool, a cinder running track, and a cycling oval. The organisation was more professional, and international participation rebounded. The London Games were also crucial for establishing standards. It was here that the marathon distance was standardised to its modern length of 26 miles and 30.85 yards. The extra distance added so the race could finish directly in front of the royal box. The Games were not without political drama. Disputes over rules and judging, particularly between the American and British teams, led to bitter accusations of bias, most famously when the American flag-bearer refused to dip the flag to King Edward VII, establishing a tradition that continues to this day. Despite the friction, London proved that the Olympics could be a standalone, major international event. The flame had been rekindled. The 1912 Games in Stockholm are often remembered as the Swedish masterpiece, the moment when the modern Olympics finally came of age and fulfilled their early promise. The Swedish organisers were models of efficiency and artistry. They built an elegant brick stadium that was a gem of architectural design, and they ran the festival with a precision and smoothness that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of Paris and St. Louis. For the first time, electronic timing devices were used for the track events, and a public address system kept the crowds informed. The arts competitions, which had been part of Coubertin's original vision, were successfully integrated, with medals awarded for architecture, painting, sculpture, literature, and music. The Stockholm Games were also notable for the remarkable performance of the Native American athlete Jim Thorpe, who won both the pentathlon and the decathlon with breathtaking ease, and was hailed by King Gustav V of Sweden as the greatest athlete in the world. His triumph, however, would be short-lived. A year later, it was revealed that Thorpe had previously been paid a pittance to play semi-professional baseball, technically violating the strict rules of amateurism. The IOC, in a rigid and heartless decision, stripped him of his medal. The Thorpe affair was a tragedy that exposed the hypocrisy and often cruel enforcement of the amateur code, a conflict that would haunt the Games for decades to come. Just as the Olympic movement had found its footing, the world plunged into the abyss of the First World War. The 1916 Games, which had been awarded to Berlin, were cancelled. The war represented the total antithesis of everything Coubertin's movement stood for. International cooperation was replaced by nationalist slaughter, peaceful competition by trench warfare, and the celebration of youth by its wholesale destruction on the battlefields of Europe. Coubertin himself, now in his 50s, even tried to enlist in the French army. The war was a profound trauma for him, and for the Olympic movement. Yet, out of this catastrophe, the Olympics found a new and more urgent sense of purpose. It was no longer just a romantic festival of sport. It became a vital instrument for peace and reconciliation in a shattered world. It was during this dark period that Coubertin, reflecting on this need for unity, designed the iconic Olympic symbol, 5 interlocking rings of blue, yellow, black, green, and red on a white background. The 5 rings represented the 5 inhabited continents of the world, their interlocking nature symbolizing their union, while the 6 colors were chosen because at least one of them appeared on the national flag of every country in the world. It was a simple, powerful emblem of global unity, born from the ashes of global conflict. The first post-war games, held in the war-ravaged city of Antwerp in 1920, were a somber but deeply meaningful affair. The central theme was one of peace and remembrance. The defeated Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire, were not invited. The opening ceremony included, for the very first time, the official flying of the 5-ringed Olympic flag. It was also at Antwerp that the Olympic oath was first sworn by an athlete, on behalf of all competitors, a new tradition designed to reinforce the principles of sportsmanship and fair play. Another new symbol was introduced, the ceremonial release of doves, as a gesture of peace. The Antwerp Games were not about grandeur or spectacle. They were about healing. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and a reaffirmation of the Olympic ideal in the face of unimaginable devastation. The Games had survived their first great global test, and had emerged with a renewed sense of moral purpose. The 1920s saw the Games continue to grow in popularity and stature. The 1924 Paris Olympics were a personal triumph for Coubertin. He was determined to erase the memory of the 1900 debacle, and he succeeded. These Games were a huge success, drawing large crowds and featuring legendary performances from athletes like the Finnish long-distance runner Paavo Nurmi, the Flying Finn, and the British runners Harold Abrahams and Eric Liddell, whose stories were later immortalized in the film Chariots of Fire. For Coubertin, it was a fitting end to his career. He retired as IOC president after the Paris Games, his life's work now secure. The 1928 Games in Amsterdam marked several more crucial innovations. For the first time, the Parade of Nations was led by the Greek team, with the host nation marching last, a tradition that continues today. But the most significant new ritual was the introduction of the Olympic flame. A fire was lit in a large cauldron on a tower, overlooking the stadium, and was kept burning for the duration of the Games. This powerful symbol immediately captured the public imagination. Amsterdam also saw another revolution, the inclusion of women in track and field events for the first time, a major step forward in a long and arduous battle for gender equality within the Olympic movement. The 1930s would see the Olympic flame, a symbol of peace and purity, co-opted and corrupted by the most sinister political ideology of the age. In 1931, long before the Nazis came to power, the IOC awarded the 1936 Games to Berlin. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, a massive international debate erupted. Calls to boycott the Berlin Games grew louder as news of the Nazi regime's brutal persecution of Jews and other minorities spread. The IOC, led by its new president Henri de Bailly-Latour and the influential American delegate Avery Brundage, insisted that the Games must go on. Clinging to the principle that politics had no place in sport, they accepted the Nazis' hollow assurances that their anti-Semitic policies would be suspended for the duration of the festival. The decision to proceed remains one of the most controversial in Olympic history, a moment when the committee's political neutrality arguably shaded into moral blindness. The stage was set for an Olympics that would be less a contest of athletes and more a meticulously stage-managed spectacle of political propaganda. The Nazi regime seized upon the Games as a golden opportunity to showcase the supposed superiority of the Aryan race and the efficiency and grandeur of the new Germany. No expense was spared. A magnificent new stadium, the Olympia Stadium, was constructed, capable of holding over 100,000 people. The ceremonies were choreographed with military precision, and the city of Berlin was scrubbed clean, its overt anti-Semitic signs temporarily removed. The chief architect of the Games' aesthetic was the propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, who understood that symbols were more powerful than speeches. A new and potent ritual was invented specifically for the Berlin Games by the chief organizer Karl Diem, the torch relay. Diem, a sports historian, conceived of a relay that would carry the Olympic flame from its source in ancient Olympia all the way to Berlin. This was a brilliant piece of propaganda, designed to forge a direct physical link between the glories of ancient Greece and the ambitions of the Third Reich. The torch relay, which we now think of as an ancient tradition, was in fact a modern political invention, created to legitimize a totalitarian regime. The German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl was commissioned by Hitler to document the games. Her resulting film Olympia is a landmark of cinema, but also a deeply unsettling piece of propaganda. It is a masterpiece of visual poetry, her camera celebrating the beauty and power of the athletic body with an almost religious fervor. The film's famous opening sequence, which shows the torch being lit in the misty ruins of Greece and then carried through idyllic landscapes towards Germany, perfectly encapsulates the Nazi appropriation of the classical ideal. Riefenstahl's innovative techniques, using slow-motion, dramatic camera angles and dynamic editing, created a heroic, mythic vision of the games that perfectly aligned with the Nazi cult of the beautiful, powerful Aryan body. While she focused on athletes from all nations, the underlying message was clear. The games were a festival of strength and beauty, whose natural inheritors were the athletes of the new Germany. Olympia remains a potent and disturbing testament to the power of art to serve a political agenda, and a clear example of how the Olympic ideal could be twisted into its opposite. Into this carefully constructed theatre of Aryan supremacy stepped an athlete who would, through his performance alone, demolish its central premise. Jesse Owens, a black American track and field athlete and the son of a sharecropper, became the undisputed star of the Berlin Games. In a stunning display of grace and power, Owens won 4 gold medals in the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, and the 4x100-meter relay. His victories were a resounding refutation of the Nazi ideology of racial hierarchy, a moment when pure athletic talent transcended politics. One of the most iconic moments came during the long jump competition, where Owens found an unlikely ally in his German rival, Luz Long. After Owens had faltered on his first 2 attempts, Long, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed embodiment of the Aryan ideal, walked over and offered him friendly advice on his run-up. Owens took the advice, qualified on his next jump, and went on to win the gold medal, with Long taking the silver. Their public display of sportsmanship and friendship was a small but powerful act of human decency in a context of immense political hatred. Owens's triumph did not stop the Nazi machine, but it created an undeniable crack in its facade of invincibility and provided the world with an enduring symbol of courage and grace under pressure. Just 3 years after the Berlin Games, the world was once again plunged into war. The Second World War was even more devastating than the First, and the Olympic Games were cancelled in both 1940, originally scheduled for Tokyo, and 1944. When the war finally ended, the world was a landscape of ruins, exhaustion, and geopolitical realignment. The first post-war games, held in London in 1948, became known as the Austerity Games. Britain was bankrupt, and food was still being rationed. No new venues were built. The events were held in existing facilities like Wembley Stadium. Athletes were housed not in a modern Olympic village, but in repurposed army barracks and college dormitories. The entire festival was run on a shoestring budget. Yet, the 1948 Games were a profound emotional success. Their simple, stripped-down nature was a perfect reflection of the post-war mood. They were not about spectacle, but about participation, about the simple, hopeful act of nations coming together again in peace. The defeated powers of Germany and Japan were not invited, but the Games marked the beginning of a slow process of global healing and were a powerful symbol of resilience and the enduring human need for the Olympic ideal. The second half of the 20th century saw the Olympic Games become a primary battleground in a new kind of global conflict, the Cold War. The entry of the Soviet Union into the Olympic movement at the 1952 Helsinki Games transformed the competition. The Games were no longer just a contest between individuals, but a proxy war between 2 opposing ideologies, capitalism and communism. The medal table was scrutinized as a barometer of national and political superiority. This rivalry fueled an intense and often bitter atmosphere. The Soviet bloc systematically violated the amateur rules by developing a class of shamateurs, athletes who were officially soldiers or students but were in fact full-time, state-sponsored professionals. This gave them a significant advantage over the genuinely amateur athletes of the West and led to decades of acrimony. The political tensions sometimes spilled over into the arena itself, most famously at the 19th. During a water polo match between the Soviet Union and Hungary, held just weeks after the brutal Soviet invasion of Hungary, the game descended into a violent brawl, with the pool turning red from the blood of a Hungarian player. The blood in the water match became a potent symbol of how the Olympic arena had become a stage for real-world political conflict. The Cold War era also saw the darkest moment in Olympic history. The 1972 Munich Games were intended to be the carefree games, a celebration designed to present a new, democratic and peaceful Germany to the world, erasing the dark memory of Berlin. But on the morning of September 5th, that dream was shattered. Members of the Palestinian terrorist group Black September infiltrated the Olympic Village and took 11 members of the Israeli team hostage. After a tense 24-hour standoff, a botched rescue attempt by West German police resulted in the deaths of all 11 hostages, along with 5 of the terrorists and 1 police officer. For the first time, the world had witnessed the horror of modern terrorism broadcast live from the heart of the Olympic sanctuary. The Games were suspended for a day for a memorial service at the main stadium, where IOC President Avery Brundage made the controversial but defiant declaration that the Games must go on. The decision to continue was debated fiercely, but it was a statement that the Olympic movement would not bow to terror. The Munich massacre was a profound trauma, a loss of innocence from which the Games would never fully recover, a brutal intrusion of the world's most violent conflicts into a space supposedly protected by a spirit of peace. The political weaponization of the Olympics reached its zenith in the late 1970s and 1980s with a series of crippling boycotts. In 1976, 29 African nations boycotted the Montreal Games to protest the inclusion of New Zealand, whose rugby team had toured apartheid-era South Africa, violating the international sporting embargo. The protest highlighted the growing power of post-colonial nations and brought the issue of racial injustice onto the Olympic stage. But the truly devastating blows came in the next 2 cycles. In 1980, the United States led a massive 66-nation boycott of the Moscow Olympics to protest the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It was a powerful political statement, but it punished thousands of athletes who had trained their entire lives for that moment. In retaliation, the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc allies boycotted the 1984 Los Angeles Games. These tit-for-tat boycotts robbed the Games of their claim to universality and threatened to tear the Olympic movement apart. By 1984, the Olympics were on the brink of collapse, seen by many as a politically corrupted, financially ruinous, and increasingly irrelevant institution. It was at this moment of crisis that the Games underwent their most profound modern transformation, this time a commercial one. The 1984 Los Angeles Games, shunned by the Soviets and facing a lack of public funds, were a huge financial risk. The city turned to a brilliant businessman named Peter Rebirth to organize the Games. Rebirth devised a revolutionary new model. Instead of relying on public money, he would finance the Games almost entirely through private corporate sponsorship and television rights. He limited the number of official sponsors, offering exclusivity to a small number of major corporations like Coca-Cola and McDonald's in exchange for massive fees. He then sold the television broadcast rights for an unprecedented sum. The result was a stunning success. The LA Games were not only a vibrant and popular festival, but they also turned a huge profit, completely reversing the trend of financially ruinous Olympics. Rebirth's model saved the Games, making them economically viable for the modern era. But it also ushered in the age of corporate Olympic. From this point on, the 5 rings would be inextricably linked with the logos of global corporations. The commercialization was so successful that it prompted the IOC to finally abandon the last vestiges of the amateurism ideal, officially opening the Games to professional athletes in the late 1980s, allowing superstars like the American Dream Team in basketball to compete in Barcelona. The end of the Cold War and the commercial revolution reshaped the Olympics once again. The 1988 Seoul Games were the last to be held under the shadow of the superpower rivalry. The 1992 Barcelona Games became a joyous celebration of a new, unified Europe and a showcase for art, design, and urban renewal. The 1996 Atlanta Games marked the centenary of the modern revival. They were a spectacle of immense athletic achievement, personified by the poignant and unforgettable image of the boxing legend Muhammad Ali, his body trembling from Parkinson's disease, courageously lighting the Olympic cauldron. But the Atlanta Games were also criticized for their crass over-commercialization, and they were scarred by a domestic terrorist bombing in Centennial Olympic Park, a tragic echo of the Munich massacre. The Games had become a global mega-event, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise facing a new set of complex, modern challenges. In the 21st century, the Olympic movement has had to grapple with these new realities. The sheer scale and cost of hosting the Games, what has been called gigantism, has become a major burden, with many host cities left with massive debts and underused, decaying venues. The persistent and ever more sophisticated problem of doping has posed a constant threat to the integrity of the competition, creating an arms race between the chemists who create performance-enhancing drugs and the scientists who try to detect them. The IOC has also faced increasing political pressure over its choice of host cities, with the awarding of the Games to countries with poor human rights records, such as China and Russia, leading to international criticism and debate. The Olympic Games, far from being separate from politics, are more deeply enmeshed in global diplomacy and controversy than ever before. These modern challenges are, in many ways, echoes of ancient ones. The ruinous expense of hosting recalls the lavish treasuries of the Greek city-states. Fight against doping is a modern version of the ancient oath against cheating, sworn before Zeus, and the political maneuvering for prestige mirrors the dynastic ambitions of Philip and the Hellenistic kings. And yet, despite all the challenges, the corruption, the commercialism, and the political strife, the dream of Olympia endures. It endures in the hushed silence of a stadium as a gymnast prepares for her routine. It endures in the roar of the crowd as a swimmer touches the wall a fraction of a second before her rival. It endures in the simple, powerful image of athletes from warring nations marching together under one flag in an opening ceremony or embracing on a podium. The modern Games are not a pure and perfect revival of their ancient predecessor, nor are they the pristine, romantic festival that Coubertin envisioned. They are a deeply flawed, complex, and often contradictory reflection of our own messy, modern world. But for a few weeks every 2 years, they still manage to captivate a global audience and provide a stage for human stories of extraordinary struggle, discipline, and triumph. The torch, first conceived as a piece of political theatre, has taken on a life of its own, becoming a genuine symbol of hope and a reminder of our shared humanity. The echo of Olympia persists, not as a command to replicate the past, but as a recurring question, a challenge posed to each new generation. Can we, for a fleeting moment, set aside our differences and come together in a spirit of peaceful, honorable competition? The answer is never certain, but the enduring power of the Olympic Games lies in our relentless, hopeful, and unending quest to triumph. Our journey, which began in a quiet, sun-drenched valley in ancient Greece, ends here, in the global glow of the modern world. We have traced the echo of the Olympic Games across 3,000 years, from a sacred ritual honoring a sky god to a worldwide spectacle of sport and commerce. The path has not been a straight line of progress, but a winding, often broken road, a story of death, rediscovery, and constant, sometimes painful, transformation. The flame we see today, for all its brilliance, carries within it the light of ancient fires, but it is also shadowed by the long and complex history it has passed through. To understand the modern Games is to understand this inheritance, the beautiful ideals we have chosen to preserve, and the inconvenient truths we have so often tried to forget. We began where the Games began, not in a stadium but in a sanctuary. We found a place already ancient before the first race was ever run, a sacred grove dedicated to the worship of Zeus. In the myths of Pelops and Heracles, and in the solemn oaths sworn before the gods, we discovered the festival's true foundation. The earliest Games were an act of piety, a channel for the ferocious Greek drive for honor, the agon. Contained within a deeply religious framework, the olive crown was its perfect symbol, a prize of no material worth, signifying that the ultimate reward was glory itself, a victory witnessed and blessed by the gods. This was the pure, sacred source from which all subsequent echoes would flow. We then witnessed the zenith of this ideal in the classical age. In the shadow of the magnificent temple of Zeus and its colossal golden and ivory statue, the Games became the ultimate expression of a civilization at its peak. This was the era of kalokagathia, the belief that physical perfection was a mirror of moral virtue. The naked athlete, celebrated in the stadium, was a living sculpture, an embodiment of balance, discipline, and the heroic struggle. The 5-day festival was a finely tuned machine of ritual, competition, and celebration, a testament to a world that saw no division between art and athletics, between the body and the soul, between the citizen and the hero. For a brief, shining moment, the games achieved a perfect and harmonious equilibrium, but no such moment can last. We charted the slow decline, the unraveling of the classical ideal in a world fractured by war and cynicism. We saw the rise of the professional athlete, the creeping influence of money, and the cynical appropriation of the games by the kings and emperors who followed. Philip of Macedon, Nero of Rome, they all came to Olympia, not as humble worshippers, but as powerful patrons who bent the sacred institution to their will. And finally, we saw the flame extinguished entirely, not by lack of interest, but by the rise of a new faith that saw the games as a pagan relic. The abolition by Theodosius was the final act, and for more than 1,000 years, Olympia itself was lost, buried under the silt of forgetting. Yet, the idea of Olympia proved more durable than its stone temples. We followed the dream of its rebirth, from the pages of Renaissance scholars to the passions of English doctors and Greek philanthropists. We saw how the rediscovery of the physical ruins by archaeologists fueled the romantic vision of a modern revival. At the center of it all was Baron de Coubertin, a man who filtered the ancient ideals through the lens of his own 19th century vision. The 1896 Athens Games were not a resurrection, but a reimagining. The gods were gone, replaced by the new deities of nationalism and secular humanism. The spirit of the Agon was now intertwined with the spirit of nation. It was a beautiful, hopeful, but fundamentally different festival, a modern creation draped in the venerated robes of antiquity. From that precarious beginning we traced the modern games through their own tumultuous history. We saw them survive near collapse, get co-opted by the sinister propaganda of Nazi Germany, and become a proxy battleground in the Cold War. We witnessed the horror of terrorism in Munich, the crippling divisions of the boycotts, and the commercial revolution that saved the movement from bankruptcy, while binding it forever to the world of corporate sponsorship. The modern games, in all their flawed glory, have become a mirror of our own complex world, reflecting our highest ideals of global unity and peaceful competition, but also our deepest political divisions, our commercial obsessions, and our endless capacity for both sublime achievement and tragic failure. And so we are left with the echo. The games of today are not the games of ancient Greece, and they are not the pristine festival Coubertin envisioned. They are something far more complicated, a global mega-event laden with immense financial and political weight. Yet, the echo persists. It persists in the athlete's solitary focus before a race, a modern form of the ancient oath. It persists in the global truce, however fragile, that allows the world to gather. And it persists in the shared universal drama of the struggle, the agon, the sight of human beings pushing their bodies and spirits to their absolute limits in the pursuit of a goal. This is the enduring, unbreakable thread that connects the modern stadium to that first dusty racetrack in a sacred grove. The original prize was a branch from a sacred olive tree. Today, it is a disc of gold, silver, or bronze. But the true prize has always been the same: a fleeting, triumphant moment of human excellence, a victory over the limitations of the self, witnessed and celebrated by the world.